Alright, hello everyone. For my final research project, we'll be discussing the war in Vendee. So, before we get into all the details, I just want to do a quick overview about the war in Vendee. The war in Vendee was a counter-revolutionary war, a rebellion, essentially, that was fought between local militias within Vendee that were assembled by the local nobility. And this was sparked by a series of revolutionary policies by the French Republic that left much of the local population disenfranchised. So the initial military campaign that was waged by the Vendee militias it started in March of 1793, and the French Convention would declare victory in October of 1793, that same year. However, fighting the final defeat of their remaining generals would not happen until January of 1794. And then after that, Vendee forces whoever was left would essentially resort to localized resistance as guerrilla warfare, and that would continue till about 1796. But the initial war, we're looking at 1793 to early 1794. So to also help understand the whole conflict, geography is also very important. So Vendee is a very rural department that is about 300 miles southwest of Paris by the 18th century road structure. And it's also important to note that as we are getting further outside of Paris and traveling outside of main trade routes in major cities, many of the roads went from being pretty robust and paved to being roads that were geared towards cheap construction and easy maintenance, which made traveling out into the countryside like Vendee much more difficult and slower than traveling on a paved road. So this journey took roughly 10 days by horse, 20 days round trip, and then 15 days for soldiers that were marching in a column, and that would be 1 month total if they were to just immediately turn around as soon as they got to Vendee. So just showing you the distance that Vendee was away, from Paris during this era, will also play into some of the reasons why this conflict happened. Also important for context is life in Vendee. So compared to the rest of rural France and northern France, or most of it, can't say all of it, life in Vendee was pretty atypical as it was very rural. There were no cities, only a few small towns that were commercial centers, but most of society was agrarian. It was mainly local peasant farmers, and we can see on this map of all these purple roads indicate major road structure within not Paris, France, within this era. If you look at Vendee, Vendee is significantly lacking the amount of infrastructure that some of these other regions on this map possess. So the local peasant farmers also had a relatively high living standard compared to other peasant farmers across France. This was likely due to the fact that they were unaffected by the droughts that were hitting most of France at this time. So, their level of income was not interrupted. Their crop yields were remaining likely the same, which allowed them to have a steady income. And then also, this population was devoutly Catholic, so they were well integrated with their local parish, for education and a focal point for the community of Vendee. And then also nobles still lived on the manors amongst the peasants, so they weren't acting as absentee landlords that were living off away in a city but still collecting the benefits of owning that land. And then already touched on that, the lack of robust roads and distance from Paris. This likely facilitated a unfamiliarity with the revolution and their grievances all the way in Paris for people in Vendée. So the revolutionary impact on Vendée is a little different than the relationship that we've been learning about with Paris and the monarchy and the convention. So the food shortages that a lot of the sans-culottes and the lower income Parisians were experiencing or even just French people in their urban centers were likely non-existent, or they were a fraction of what was being experienced. Going back to the fact that droughts were not affecting this region. Um, it's unlikely that Indians were experiencing the type of food shortages that other people were experiencing, which was a major factor into the revolution. Vendians also had a great relationship with the First Estate. They were devoutly Catholic, so the relationship between local Vendians and their clergymen was positive. The perspective for the Vendians. And the relationship with the Second Estate was comparably better, as the nobles still lived amongst the peasant farmers. And it's also important to note that no chateaus are burned during the initial revolution. So the grievances that we saw that led from the Third Estate that led to the revolution, a lot of animosity towards the First and Second Estate, might not have been as severe or polarized in Vendée as it was in other parts of France. So once the revolutionary government came in power and started to de-Catholicize France, we saw churches being made public institutions and items within churches being confiscated or sold off. Churches in Vendée some of them were being made into barracks to house Republican soldiers. And this removal of the clergy from Vendée society likely led to not only a drop in education, but also a loss in sense of identity. Because we've already established that Vendeans were devoutly Catholic. So taking away an institution that defines their identity is going to affect them, very negatively. And then also the strong relationship with the Catholic Church, likely contributed to an above average support for the monarchy, as the monarchy drew a lot of its justification and power from the Catholic Church. So the early stages of this counter-revolution was already happening in 1789 to 1792, when the activity was limited to protests and small violent clashes. It hadn't gotten to the level that it would get to in 1793. There was discontent with some of the stuff that was going on in Paris and the way the country was moving, especially with the attitude towards Catholicism. However, that would really change when King Louis would be executed, and the convention would basically mandate that each department fills quotas to fill the slots they need for the Republic's army. And so many Vendeans likely saw the execution of King Louis as the final elimination of Catholicism in France, and then on top of that, Vendeans are being forced or being told, hey, you need to join. You're getting conscripted into an army to serve a government that you share little grievances with and beliefs with. A government that is eliminating a focal point of their identity from French life. So this is what is considered the trigger for the armed rebellion. Local nobility mobilized about 80,000 local Vendeans. They fought under the name of Catholic and royal armies. Local nobility would also lead them into battle and command these quote-unquote armies. However, these armies were extremely ill-equipped. Many soldiers didn't even have muskets or any sort of flintlock rifle or gun, and they were armed with mainly farm equipment, such as like scythes, machetes, hand-to-hand combat type equipment, and it was mainly made up of peasant farmers and laborers. So it wasn't a professional army. It was a poorly trained, poorly equipped army that was being used to fight back against the French Republic. So while all this is happening, the National Convention, is obviously discussing the issues that are going on in Vendée, and the view about Vendée is obviously not well received inside the convention. Many of the members of the convention see this as aristocrats trying to regain their power and using religion as a facade or as a mask to their true intentions. But then we also have this large consensus that these are royal fanatics and religious fanatics, and that they need to be fought with quote-unquote liberty fanatics, that we need to fight back against these royal and religious fanatics with our values of liberty. And there was a strong support for total quote-unquote annihilation of Vendée royalists and religious fanatics within the convention. If you going through the parliamentary archives of a lot of these discussions about Vendée, the word annihilation comes up a lot when discussing how to deal with the rebel forces in Vendée. And so, segueing into how the French Republic would respond to this, we already talked about that distance. That distance allowed for early Vendéan success, because they were only able to immediately respond with whatever garrisons they had in the region, which numbered only a couple thousand. So the Vendéan army was able to take control of minor areas around Vendée before they suffered a massive loss at Nantes, a city that is just north of Vendée. However, once larger Republican forces would arrive, we already talked about how poorly trained and equipped they were. They're now fighting a force that is, yes, they're conscripts, but most of these people are well equipped, and they've gone through some sort of training, some sort of professional training. So this would lead to Republican forces suppressing this rebellion quickly and brutally. And the National Convention would announce that victory prevailed in October of 1793. And the Vendée forces' momentum would end in a debated genocide. It's debated whether it was genocide or not. However, Vendean villages were essentially razed. They were burned to the ground on orders by military commanders, and their residents were massacred by what they called infernal columns. So essentially, soldiers were ordered to burn anything that could burn. After the pacification of this rebellion, Catholic churches were turned into temples of reason briefly, and these massacres were intended to eliminate any Vendean who was not fully loyal to the French Republic, basically trying to homogenize the French political structure. They're making sure that there's not going to be any individual left in Vendee that can either A, stomach a massacre like that after a rebellion, or B, that just flat out doesn't support fully supports the Republic regardless. And so this kind of to wrap this all up is, could federalism have saved Vendee? I want to throw this question out there to kind of think about the French political structure at this time, and if there's anything that hindsight's 2020, but if there was a different approach to government at this time, could that have saved Vendee? So we already discussed that Vendee was very different from other parts of France, and the policies that were coming out of Paris were much more suited for Parisians and city dwellers rather than the population of Vendee that was rural and devoutly Catholic. We saw a lot throughout the French Revolution that Parisians and sans-culottes had the privilege to be able to show up to these government institutions in person and in mass and make these demands on the government. And so the distance from Paris, did not permit for a Vendee citizen or a Vendee resident to join these protests or these rallies for liberty or for change. And so it likely made them very unheard in the shaping of revolutionary policies. And these policies that were passed likely, not likely, they did treat France like it was a monolith, which it isn't. We've already discussed that France at this time was not a monolith. It was, there's different cultures and languages throughout the entire country. And so these policies probably made Vendeans feel this extreme disenfranchisement. And so, I think that decentralized rule and a localized, limited amount of autonomy to allow Vendeans to maintain their relationship with the Catholic Church and their clergy could have eased tensions that wouldn't have resulted in a full-scale war and wouldn't have resulted in these infernal columns, suppressing revolution, what they saw as counter-revolutionary sentiment, burning villages and killing men, women, and children in these villages. This does, however, wrap up my final project about the war in Vendee. Thank you for taking your time to listen to it. I hope you guys learned something from it, and appreciate you guys being here. Thank you.